How do psychologists actually figure out what makes a person tick? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're opening up the Clinical Playbook. You can think of this as a master class, where I get to teach you exactly how professionals structurally gather and interpret human data. It's built for clinicians in training, but honestly, it's absolutely fascinating for anyone curious about the human mind. So let's just dive right in. Here is our syllabus for today. We're going to walk sequentially through the 4 vital steps of a patient's assessment journey. We'll start with the foundations of clinical assessment, move right into the clinical interview, explore clinical observation methods, and finally wrap the whole thing up with integration and case formulation. Okay, part 1, foundations of clinical assessment, moving beyond the test. To really understand assessment, you've got to realize it's way more than just handing someone a test and getting a single score back. It is a comprehensive, iterative decision-making process. Now, if you're taking notes, here's a crucial exam perspective I want to teach you. As a clinician, you're constantly balancing 2 types of data, nomothetic and idiographic. Think of nomothetic data as the map, and idiographic data as the highly specific terrain of the person sitting right in front of you. You see, nomothetic data compares a patient's scores to a larger norm group, so you get a baseline. But the ultimate goal of assessment, that is to reach an idiographic understanding. You want to understand that unique, highly specific individual. Basically, you use the nomothetic map to navigate the idiographic terrain. So how do we make sure that unique, idiographic picture is actually accurate? Well, modern clinicians rely on a concept called triangulation. If you rely on just one single source of data, you are practically guaranteeing bias. Instead, you need a multi-method approach. Clinicians gather data from multiple methods, like combining interviews with psychological tests, and they speak to multiple informants. That could be the client themselves, sure, but also family members or even teachers. This triangulation dramatically improves the validity of the clinical picture and cuts down on any single source's bias. Moving on to part 2. The clinical interview, a conversation with a purpose. When we step into the interview room, the very first thing I need to teach you is that a clinical interview is definitely not a social chat. It is a one-sided, highly purposeful interaction. Imagine a patient walks in. You might start off with an intake interview just to hear their chief complaints and figure out if you can actually help them. Then you might need a case history to build a detailed chronological timeline of their life, literally from birth to their current medical history. Now, if you're zeroing in on a specific disorder, you'd use a diagnostic interview, which is specifically designed to check off symptom criteria in manuals like the DSM-5 or ICD-11. Or, if there's an emergency like a suicide risk, you immediately pivot to a crisis interview for support and safety planning. And running in the background of all of this, that's the mental status examination, or MSE. It's a protocol where you organize your observations on the patient's appearance, behavior, speech, and cognition. To actually navigate these interviews, you've got to use a specific communication strategy known as the funnel approach. You aren't just interrogating the patient. You start at the wide end of the funnel with step 1, broad, open-ended questions. This invites the client to elaborate, freely share their narrative. Once you have that big picture, you move to step 2 at the narrow end of the funnel. This is where you use closed questions to gather those tight, specific details you need for an accurate diagnosis. But hey, knowing what to ask is really only half the battle. How you physically sit and listen is absolutely crucial. Clinicians are trained in attending skills, which is often remembered by the acronym SOLAR. When you're sitting there, you should be running a constant mental checklist. Am I squarely facing the client? Is my posture open? Am I leaning forward, keeping good eye contact, and remaining relaxed? These foundational physical skills are the bedrock. They enable deeper, active listening techniques that build rapport, things like clarifying what the client said, paraphrasing their content, and reflecting their own emotions back to them. Now, keep in mind, these foundational skills have to adapt when you're working with special populations. You can't just use the exact same interview style for everyone. If you're assessing children, for instance, you need immense flexibility. You're going to use simplified vocabulary and sometimes even puppets like a pair named Iggy and Ziggy, just to match the child's cognitive development. On the flip side, when working with culturally diverse clients, you adapt by using the Cultural Formulation Interview, or CFI. This specifically explores the client's cultural identity and asks for their own cultural explanation for their distress. Okay, let's hit pause for a second. Before any of those specialized questions are asked, professional standards have to take center stage. Informed consent must absolutely precede the interview. As a clinician, you have to outline the purpose of the assessment, the fees, and most importantly, the absolute limits of confidentiality. Look, if there's a risk of child abuse or self-harm, the client needs to know upfront that you are legally bound to report it. You've got to establish those boundaries before any real data gathering begins, no exceptions.
All right, part 3, clinical observation, recording behavior as it happens. Interviews are fantastic tools, for sure, but they do rely on retrospective recall. And let's be honest, that is notoriously flawed because, well, people misremember things. That's exactly why we step out of the interview room and use direct clinical observation. What's theoretically fascinating to teach here is the shift in perspective. We aren't just looking at a behavior as a sign or a symptom of some deep underlying personality trait anymore. Instead, modern observation views behavior as a literal sample of how that person interacts with their specific environment in real time.
To analyze these behavioral samples systematically, we use the ABC model of functional behavioral assessment. It's essentially a way to rigorously deconstruct a problem behavior. Step 1 is identifying the antecedents. What happened right before the behavior? What were the triggers? Step 2 is the behavior itself. What was the exact action? And step 3 looks at the consequences. What happens immediately after that maintains or reinforces the behavior. So as an example, if a child acts out, that's the behavior. Was the antecedent a difficult math test? And was the consequence getting sent out to the hall, thus successfully avoiding the work? By breaking it down like this, the path to treatment becomes so much clearer.
Clinicians have a handful of practical methods for gathering this observational data. They can do naturalistic observation, literally going directly into the client's home or school. If that's just too difficult, they'll use controlled or analog observation, which involves contrived clinic situations like role plays to elicit the behavior. Then there's self-monitoring, where the client records their own symptoms in real time, like keeping a worry diary. And today, since we're in the digital age, clinicians even use ecological momentary assessment. That's a fancy way of saying they use high-tech smartphone prompting to ask clients to record their mood or behavior multiple times a day as they just go about their normal lives.
There is, however, one major limitation to observation, and it's a phenomenon called reactivity. Just think about it. How differently do you act when you notice your boss walking past your desk? Humans naturally act differently when they know someone, especially a psychologist, is watching them. The very act of observing can actually change the behavior you're trying to measure. It's a fundamental challenge that clinicians constantly have to account for in the real world. Which brings us to part 4, integration and case formulation, putting the pieces together. We're now in the final phase of the clinical playbook. The clinician takes all this diverse data, the interview notes, the standardized test scores, the observational data, and literally sits at their desk to integrate it. The big secret I want to teach you here is that clinicians actively hunt for inconsistencies to help put this giant puzzle together. If a client claims they're completely calm, but you observe them constantly fidgeting, that inconsistency is a vital clue. Sifting through these clues allows the clinician to synthesize a case formulation. Think of it as a working hypothesis that links all of the patient's psychosocial factors to their current condition, establishing a really firm baseline to guide their future treatment. Now, when finalizing this case formulation, it is vital to maintain strict professional standards. Future clinicians are heavily urged to practice cultural humility to avoid what's known as diagnostic overshadowing. That's a phenomenon where a clinician focuses so heavily on one prominent trait, like a single severe symptom, that they completely miss other crucial clinical issues. Like, for example, assuming a patient's physical pain is just anxiety because they have a history of panic attacks. You have to watch out for that. Furthermore, you must rely strictly on evidence-based assessment, only utilizing tools that have proven psychometric reliability and validity. And that brings us to a hard-hitting point, and honestly, another great perspective if you're studying for exams, the debate between clinical prediction and statistical prediction. Clinical prediction is based entirely on subjective human judgment, the clinician's intuition and experience. Statistical prediction, on the other hand, relies on structured actuarial data, meaning hard numbers, statistics, and algorithms. So what's the truth? Well, research consistently proves that structured statistical methods actually outperform subjective human clinical judgment. When in doubt, leaning on structured data significantly improves your diagnostic accuracy. Which leaves us with this final, fascinating question to ponder. If structured statistical data is consistently more accurate than our own subjective judgment, does human intuition still have a place in clinical assessment? It's a massive debate that really forces us to question the future of therapy itself as these assessment technologies continue to advance. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this masterclass gave you a clear, structured view right into the clinical playbook.